Hey folks, my name is Addy Osmani, and I'm an engineering lead working on the Chrome team at Google. I've been there for 10 years, leading teams of different sizes, and today I'm excited to share a few of my lessons about building effective engineering teams. Now, one of my first experiences of effectiveness was when I was in the US for the first time. I was visiting my wife's family in Missouri, which is home to the American black bear. Now, at some point in your life, you've probably heard the advice, if you're attacked by a black bear, play dead. Now, what one sign says is actually a great lesson in effectiveness. It says, if you're attacked by a black bear, play dead. It will be good practice for when you die a couple of minutes later. Playing dead is always the wrong action. If a black bear is near you, the black bear is not going to say, it's a human. They saw me and they fell asleep. They must be a badass. They're not going to do that. Stay calm and remain still instead. So today we're going to talk about my 3 E's for effective engineering teams: enable, empower, and expand. Enabling is all about defining what effectiveness means for your engineering org and then teaching the best practices to your teams for achieving it. Empowering is understanding what's stopping you from getting effective. Distractions can cut into your growth, and we really want to tear through that and help teams to become effective and begin scaling that thinking out. And then expand. As your organizations grow, your role as a leader changes, and you need to set up your organizations to be able to scale well so that your execution can be effective. So let's kick things off with, how do you enable effectiveness? Now, it may be efficient to get a drink and a shower from a sink at the same time. It may not be effective if you're just thirsty. So to enable effectiveness, we first need to define what that is. We can consult literature here. So Peter Drucker, in his famous book, The Effective Executive, defined the difference between being efficient and being effective as efficiency is the capacity to do the right thing, and effectiveness is the efficiency is the capacity to do things right, and effectiveness is the capacity to do the right thing. Ideally, you are doing the right things right. These are not mutually exclusive. Now, finding the sweet spot requires a few crucial things. You need strategy. Now, if effectiveness is achieved by making improvements to the right things to achieve organizational goals, then the first step is to find those objectives. The second is metrics. Once your org has defined its goals, you've created your strategy, it's really crucial to determine how you measure effectiveness in your plan. And through that, you can figure out what the relationship is to things like efficiency drivers. And then commitment, like seeing the follow-through. Now, very often when we talk about efficiency and we talk about effectiveness, people start thinking about productivity. And we can sometimes get into this trap of only measuring our success in terms of productivity metrics. And when I say productivity, I mean things like measuring your team's throughput, velocity, quality, capacity, all of these things, sometimes even lines of code. And while all of these things are important, those are outputs. Those are not necessarily the things that are the most important to the business. What's really important is the outcomes. Like, what is the value we're driving back to our business? How are we moving up our KPIs? And so my tip is generally try to focus on outcomes over outputs while acknowledging that they're both important. We're talking about effective engineering teams, and we can't talk about teams before we talk about the individuals. So what are traits of an effective engineer? My list started out strong here. I thought that, runs from bears is probably a good place to start. But really, what are traits of an effective engineer? When I started thinking about this, what came to mind was a few things. It was things like you care about the user. You care about their needs more than you do any specific technology stack or technology decisions. They're good problem solvers. They're people who can build up trust, autonomy, and social capital over time. Now, this list is imperfect, right? Like, everybody here can probably think of a dozen other things that you would think of when you think of an effective engineer. What we can also think about is anti-patterns for effectiveness. And I think that these are also really valuable for spotting where your teams could use a little bit of help. There's this excellent free book available from Pluralsight, actually, called 20 Patterns to Watch For in Your Engineering Team. And they cover all of these topics in depth. Things like people who, overhelp a little bit too much or have very long-standing PRs. Maybe they're people who hoard the code and are not the best collaborators in your teams. But being able to spot these things can be really powerful. So what are traits of an effective team? There is a lot of material on this topic that we can consult. And one of my favorites is a book called Drive by Daniel Park. And in it, Daniel Park talks about these things: autonomy, mastery, purpose, and how do they contribute to building effective teams. Autonomy is this desire to be self-directed, to have ownership. Mastery is that urgency to get better at skills, your craftsmanship. Purpose is the desire to do something that has meaning and is important in the big picture. Now, while I encourage everybody to check out the existing literature on this, I wanted to talk a little bit about our experiences here at Google. At Google, people decisions tend to be based on research and data. Now, many years ago, as Google was growing, what we wanted to find out was, what are the traits of really good managers? People wanted to be able to understand what made for effective collaborations across the company, and managers were one of the first places we thought were important to start. You may have heard of Project Oxygen. So Project Oxygen discovered kind of 10 traits of Google's best managers. Things like being a good coach, having a clear vision and a strategy, being productive and results-orientated. And then over time, we ended up updating some of these. So some of the ones in bold are slightly more recent. Things like the importance of building inclusive engineering teams, showing concern for your success and well-being of your folks. Now, based on the success of Project Oxygen, Google's researchers ended up applying a very similar method to discovering the secrets of effective teams. And this gave birth to Project Aristotle. It's based on Aristotle's quote, "The whole is greater than the sum of the parts." And this was all about trying to answer the question, what makes a team at Google effective? This is a painting of Plato and Aristotle. It kind of looks like they have invisible basketballs that they're holding up right now. This is kind of what it looks like, just in case you're curious. So when we kicked off the project, the first question we had to answer was, what does effectiveness mean? How do we define it? More lines of code don't necessarily mean a good thing. More bugs fixed may mean that we had more bugs in the first place. And so instead, the team decided to use a combination of qualitative assessments and quantitative measures. For qualitative assessments, we ended up talking to people from 3 different perspectives: executives, team leads, and team members. Executives were most concerned with results. So what is the return on investment for the business? How are we moving the business goals? People that were on teams cared a lot about team culture and thought that was important for effectiveness. And then you had folks in the middle, the team leadership, who cared a lot about ownership, vision, and goals. They cared a little bit about the team culture, a little bit about the results. But then there was a lot of data that was collected. The researchers measured team effectiveness talking to the executive teams, team leads, team members, sales performance teams. They conducted 201 interviews. And they looked at a number of things. They asked Googlers over 250 questions about the types of things they thought could have been related to team effectiveness. Things like team dynamics, personality traits, skill sets, so your programming skills, your client management. They ran a number of statistical models on these to understand, what drives effectiveness. They also learned, what didn't matter. Now, this may only apply to Google. I always encourage folks to do their own research. But in Google's case, what we discovered was things like co-location of your teammates, workload size, seniority, team size, consensus-driven decision-making. These ended up mattering a little bit less to teams. What did matter? Well, one takeaway was the researchers found what really mattered was less about who is on the team and more about how the team ultimately works together. Now, effective Google teams have 5 dynamics. These are psychological safety, dependability, structure and clarity, meaning, and impact. Now, of these 5 dynamics, psychological safety was by far the most important. The researchers found that individuals on teams with higher psychological safety were less likely to leave the company. They were more likely to harness the power of really diverse ideas from their teammates. They were good at collaborating. They brought in more revenue. And they were rated more effective by executives. Now, Amy Edmondson, the author of Teaming, which I recommend, it's a great book, defines psychological safety as the shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Now, what Project Aristotle found was that teams who felt safe bet their sales targets anywhere up to 17% more, while teams that didn't really feel safe didn't necessarily make those targets quite as well. Teams who felt safe tend to be highly rated on effectiveness by their leadership, anywhere up to 80%. Contrast that to teams who don't feel as safe. Now, we talked about the importance of psychological safety. Dependability is also on here. On dependable teams, members are able to complete high-quality work on time, they get things done, and they meet their high bar of expectations. Structure and clarity, it's really important, we know, to have clear roles, plans, and goals for your teams, meaning the work is important to your team members, and then impact. People feel that they're actually driving important change. Now, if you want to apply some of this thinking to your teams, what I recommend is framing all of this work as a learning problem rather than an execution problem. Acknowledge your fallibility, model curiosity, ask a lot of questions. Ultimately, software development is a team sport, and high-functioning teams are gold. They're the true key to our success. And harnessing and scaling effectiveness ends up becoming a large part of our jobs. But this is where we have, trickiness. We have things like interpersonal issues to deal with, ill-suited skill sets sometimes. And it's really important to understand that at the end of the day, if you want to reach nirvana in your teams, you do need a culture of humility, trust, and respect. Now, humility is people acknowledging that they're not the center of the universe. You're neither omniscient nor you're infallible. You're open to self-improvement. Respect, you genuinely care about the people you work with. You treat them as human beings. You appreciate their abilities and accomplishments. And trust, you believe others are competent and are ultimately going to do the right things. So the first thing to do is enable. Understand what effectiveness means for your org. The next thing we're going to talk about is how do you empower effectiveness. Effective engineering teams are usually not the ones trying to get more done just by working more hours. They're the ones who can get things done efficiently. They focus the limited time that they have on tasks that produce the most value. There's some great content about this by Edmund Lau, by the way. Now, we're all used to performance evaluations and doing performance evaluations in many cases for our folks, where we're asked, what have you contributed in the last 6 months? I never have really good answers for this personally, but it's really important that as you're making your team effective, you understand what that means, and then you can present that out in performance reviews and things like that. But it's also really important that you define what effectiveness means for you, because it all starts with you as a leader. Now, in every area of effectiveness within an organization, you feed the opportunities and you starve the problems as much as you can. Ultimately, you're going to have finite time as well. You need to know where your time goes, know where your time counts. There's generally always going to be more to do than we have time for. Focus on what you and only you can contribute. We're going to talk more about this idea later. The secret of effectiveness is concentration. Very often it can feel like we're trying to spread ourselves thin and do a million things at once, but concentration is actually really important. Do one major thing at a time. Make effective decisions. We all have to deal with, problems around prioritization. One of the more difficult parts of prioritization is deciding what not to do. Try to grow your skills in understanding what not to do, what's actually those opportunities that are probably not going to be valuable long term for your teams. What's preventing your team from being effective? I always encourage leaders to consider team effectiveness models. Now, effectiveness models give you a framework for better understanding your team, what they're experiencing, and how you can empower them to do their best work. One of the models that I like is the Lencioni model by Patrick Lencioni. And it's structured like a pyramid with trust at the very bottom and inattention at the top. You really need to start at the bottom, work all your way up. And there's a few things here worth keeping in mind. The first one at the very bottom in a dysfunctional team is absence of trust. We were just talking about psychological safety a moment ago. Absence of trust. If your team doesn't trust you or each other, they're not going to do their best work. Fear of conflict. Healthy conflict is necessary if you're going to live up to your full potential. Unhealthy conflict means that people are going to keep butting heads, but healthy conflict can be good for growth. Lack of commitment. You need to be able to see things through. If folks are not seeing things through, they can bring down the whole team. There needs to be an accountability. There needs to be an attention to results. If you're not paying attention to your results, you're never going to know when you've hit them. But the Lencioni models we're checking out. Another good one is Tuckman's team model. A lot of folks are kind of familiar with this. It's got 4 stages. There's forming, storming, norming, and performing. Forming is really the stage, and this applies very much when, especially when you're creating new organizations or you've joined new teams. Forming is when your team are really just coming together. They don't really know what's going on. Maybe they're feeling each other out, understanding how the team's going to work. Storming is when they're still trying to get to know each other, but as they become more familiar, things like power struggles start to emerge. Norming is when the team finds its relative groove, and they have a better understanding of how the team works. And performing is really where the magic happens. At that stage, your team trusts and respects each other. Now, there are lots of other models that you can check out. Team effectiveness models, they're useful tools. They're not going to magically transform your team overnight. So be patient with yourselves, be patient with your team. Consider picking a model sticking with it, getting the team involved, bring in experts if you need to bring in experts, and be patient. I think that these models can actually add some value sometimes. The next thing we're going to talk about is how you multiply effectiveness. There's this awesome book by Liz Weissman called Multipliers that I highly recommend. And it captures one of my key values, investing in others and empowering them to reach their full potential. In Multipliers, Liz compares communication that builds and unlocks the potential of others, and it contrasts it against communication that diminishes. Now, generally, there are two kinds of leaders. There are those who make you feel like you were born to do your job, and there are those who make you dread going into work. Those are respectively multipliers and diminishers. Now, there are a number of examples in here. There are folks like talent magnets, people who excel at bringing teams together and maximizing their talents. Liberators, people who push you, they create an intense environment, but they lead you to do your best, and they actually care about the health of the team and the outcomes. And then on the other hand, we've got folks who are like tyrants, who create a stifling tension. They instill fear in their teams, and maybe it might not actually get the most out of them. Now, most diminishing ends up being accidental. A lot of people are trying to do their best, they've got good intentions, but like it or not, the impact on the team is the same. Diminishers only get about half of the true power out of their people. We all have accidental diminisher moments. And the secret to the multiplier effect is knowing what your vulnerabilities are and turning those situations into multiplier moments. Maybe you're an idea person. Maybe you want to stimulate ideas in other people. The outcome of that might be that you're overwhelming your team because they're going to be chasing your idea of the day constantly, and they won't know where to focus. A workaround for that is creating a holding tank for your ideas. Maybe put those ideas in that tank, sit on them for a little while, and then only talk to the team about the ones that you think are actually high impact and can wait for later. You have people who are rescuers, folks who, really want to make sure nothing goes off the rails. And that's where we get into, folks who may be a little bit too controlling or micromanaging. The outcome of that is that people become dependent on you, probably too dependent on you. And instead of always being the person who's rushing to answer that email first or get everything done, you can always approach it via questions instead. It's like, ask your team, how would you solve this? How would you fix this? How do you think about this? Multipliers raise the game of each of their teammates. They increase the intelligence and achievements of the team. One good example of this is Magic Johnson. When Magic Johnson was younger, he tended to be, he's really, really skilled. He tends to be the person everyone would pass the ball to. And coaches would say, hey, just pass it to Magic because he's going to score and win us the game. But what Magic noticed is that, at the end of the game, yes, maybe they won, but you had a bench full of really sad-looking teammates because they didn't have a chance to be lifted up. They didn't have a chance to shine. And so he focused instead on being a multiplier and trying to raise the level of everybody. So I think that there are a few things you can do to start thinking about how to be a multiplier. Focus on one skill you can maximize, one you can neutralize, challenge your assumptions, seek feedback, and don't just stop with yourself when you're thinking about a multiplier culture. This can apply to everybody under you too. Now the next thing I want to talk about is your engineering culture. Your engineering culture really, really matters. And there are many aspects of Google's engineering culture that have helped us get effective that I'd like to talk about. It's important to have a culture that your team values and is willing to defend. Now, Google's culture taught me a number of things about scaling effectiveness. 4 key things: sharing, reusing, standardizing, and automation. These have had a huge impact to Google's engineering culture over the last decade. What does this mean? Well, the first one is acknowledging that sharing tools, abstractions, and conventions can be really powerful. Solving a problem really well once and then getting everybody internally or your company to adopt it has had huge payoffs for us. In the early days, Google would invest in our own frameworks, tools, abstractions, common libraries, protocol buffers, all of these things, and they'd be used across the entire engineering organization. Each team spending fewer mental cycles choosing which tools to use, meant that we could have a dedicated tools team that would try to improve everybody's productivity instead of, splintering this across every team having to do it themselves. Allowing those fixes to propagate to everyone was really powerful. The next one was the importance of investing in reusable training materials to onboard new engineers. One of the reasons that Google became productive was that we invested so much in training and education. When my teams wanted to pick up things like Go or TypeScript or internal frameworks, we were able to consult a lot of this guidance. And these guidances covered, core abstractions at the company, as well as all of the lessons that engineering teams learned every year. There was a lot of encouragement to try improving those docs, improving, frequently asked questions, all of those things. Without them, it would have just taken so much longer for everybody to onboard. And I can't, talk about, the value of all of this without talking about automation. Never spend 6 minutes doing something that you can spend 6 hours trying to automate. We have all been there. And I think that, when we think about automation, it's useful to be very, very concrete. Automation is a force multiplier, but it's not going to fix everything, and it's not a magic bullet. One of the values of automation is consistency. Any action performed by humans hundreds or thousands of times is not going to be performed the same way every single time. And the value of consistency is one of the key values that we get out of automation. Once you have sort of a platform of consistency in place, you can enable it to be extensible. People can build on top of this idea. And what it means is that you can centralize mistakes so that if issues need to be fixed, they can be fixed once in one place and then propagated and scaled out to everybody else. That leads to things like faster repairs. Everybody not having to worry about dealing with consistency problems, dealing with as much tech debt around this, means that you can ultimately get to good cost savings. Another thing I like to say is time is probably your greatest asset. It's your greatest asset as a leader. It's your greatest team's asset as well. And if we want mastery, this implies a high ratio of value shipped to hours work. It means that you as a leader, your TLs, your teams are able to discern tasks that add value and can drive energy in that direction. It also means that you can avoid work that doesn't provide the team or the company as much value. The best engineers can steer whole teams away from this. Maybe you don't need that multi-year rewrite. Maybe there's something else that you could be doing with that time instead. Now, effective engineering teams recognize time as their most precious asset. They focus on high-leverage activities. Former Intel CEO Andrew Grove explained in High Output Management, his book, that leverage is the amount of value that you produce per unit of time. And increase your leverage, you can ask yourself a few questions. What if the thing we're doing was simpler? Maybe that decreases time costs. What if this was huge? Maybe that could increase value. What else could I be doing? Maybe that's your opportunity cost. But in general, think about what you're using time for and ways that you can squeeze out a little bit more efficiency and effectiveness from it. And finally, we're going to talk about how you expand effectiveness and how you enable your organization to be able to scale out some of these ideas. A lot of this work is heavily inspired by a really great book. It's called Debugging Teams by Ben Collins Sussman and Brian Fitzpatrick. I heavily recommend this book. I believe you can read it for free online. So do check it out. Now, when you work at Google, you end up getting asked a lot of hard questions. I don't always know how to answer these questions, but we do get asked some hard questions, such as this one. Legal, please don't fire me. And one of the hard questions that leaders sometimes ask me is, how do you scale how you lead for effectiveness? Because this is a slightly different variation of what we've been talking about. As an organization grows, your role as a leader changes. Things like distractions and complications are going to multiply. How you think about communication, delegation, decision-making, team structure, all of this is going to need to have to evolve. How you approach this for a team of 5 people is going to differ to a team of 20 or 30 or 50. Now, as you're growing as a leader, it's going to become a lot more about the people. It's going to become a lot less about your technical expertise. And the broader your domain continues to become, you're going to become even more removed from the day-to-day. And your decision-making is going to start becoming much more higher level. Now, Ben, in this book, defines a really good model that I've been using called the art of leadership. And it basically suggests 3 things. Always be deciding, always be leaving, and always be scaling. Always be deciding means identify the changes that need to be made and how to make smart and intentional trade-offs. Always be leaving is about making your team self-sufficient so you're free to move on to the next challenge. And always be scaling is about compressing your success patterns so that you can take on bigger problems. So what do we mean by always be deciding? Managing a team of teams means that you're making decisions at ever higher levels. Your job is going to become a lot more about high-level strategy, more so than solving specific engineering tasks. And at that level, most of the decisions you make are going to be about finding out the right set of trade-offs. How do you do that? Well, here are some basic steps to approaching ambiguity and making smart decisions. When you first approach really ambiguous problems, what you can sometimes find is inertia is your biggest obstacle. There are going to be people who have been steeped in the problem for so long that they're wearing blinders. They just can't see the issues. Maybe they've been in the forest for so long that they just can't see through those trees. They'll say like, oh, this is just how we've always done it. Why should we change it? And it's really important to kind of tease this apart. Once you're able to understand the trade-offs a little bit better, how they work, that can empower you to make better decisions. And then you are able to explain these and hopefully be able to guide your team through it. Always believing, what does this mean? Well, this is a quote from a former Google engineering director, Varit Mediratta. And what he meant here is you shouldn't just solve hard problems. You should get your team to solve the problem without you present, ideally. If you can do that, you're free to move on to the next hard problem and leave a trail of self-sufficient success in your wake. Now, a lot of the time when we throw out this idea of leaving, your first thought is, well, I don't necessarily trust everything's going to be done. Something's surely going to get messed up. There's surely going to be fires. And this comes down to, are you currently a single point of failure? We've all heard of the bus factor. If you end up getting hit by a bus, is your team going to still go on? Do you have successors in mind who'd be able to help the team continue thriving? I'll say that the answer is not always that clear, and it's worth thinking about. I think that if you're able to shift yourself away from being a single point of failure, that's also good for you, too, because you ultimately want to land on building a self-driving machine. Think of a self-driving machine as something that's self-sufficient and self-perpetuating. This is really hard, but it gets back to what I was saying earlier about leadership being more about organizing people and a little bit less about being a technical expert. So how do you do this? Well, divide the space into problems. Delegate those sub-problems to future leaders. They don't have to be current leaders. Delegate them to future leaders and keep adjusting what's not working. This is a very iterative process. People are always constantly changing too. Figure out how to support your leaders. They're likely going to make mistakes. You need to let them make mistakes, enable that growth. And the hardest part of this always ends up being delegation. Doing everything yourself, even as a leader, even as a senior leader, is the easy way out. But it makes you into a single point of failure. If you agree that your mission is to build a self-driving organization, the main mechanism of teaching ends up being through delegation. So you have to build a set of self-sufficient leaders, and delegation is absolutely the most effective way to train them. Give them an assignment, let them fail, let them try and try again. That's how they're going to grow. Now, I mentioned earlier this idea of what can I do that nobody else can? This is a really, really important question. Ask yourself this regularly. Do that work instead. It may well be strategy. You may need to keep refining it. You may need to keep mapping out your forest, delegating those trees. When you find yourself fixing problems that are in the weeds, try to stop. Ask yourself this question instead. Maybe you just need a better blueprint for your organization. Maybe you need to put a little bit more time into that master plan. But try to focus on what you and only you can do. Let's say that you're able to build this self-driving machine. What do you do next? Well, direct the machine. Keep it healthy. Always be leaving. Once you've got that freedom, you're able to move on to new problems, whether it's expanding your scope, expanding your organization, taking on new problems. That can be a good way to avoid burnout every few years. That doesn't mean become an absentee leader. That's another problem. You don't want to become an absentee leader completely. What you want to do is tap the blimp. There's this really good analogy made in debugging teams around tapping the blimp. So what does that mean? Well, imagine your team or organization to be this huge blimp. It's got a lot of surface area. Gets a lot done, but sometimes it moves very slowly. Your job is to spend most of your time observing it. Listen to your reports. Listen to your customers. Listen to people you work with. Understand what's working and what isn't. Is your self-driving blimp actually heading in the right direction? And then once in a while, after a lot of consideration, just gently tap it back into place. You don't have to, do this every week or anything like that, but just gently tap it back into place. That is the art of management. 90% of it is listening, and 10% of it is gentle taps to redirect. Always be scaling. You really want to embrace the cycle of struggle and success. Once you're able to compress your success patterns, if you're able to successfully do that, once you're able to successfully delegate, you may be able to do what you were previously doing in half the time. You may be able to free yourself up time to be able to tackle other kinds of problems. And sometimes folks will ask, well, that sounds great at a very high level. How do I actually do that? And we can always learn a lot from Marie Kondo. So if you don't know who Marie Kondo is, Marie Kondo talks about this philosophy of taking a deeper look at your physical possessions. About 20% of your stuff might be useless junk, 60% might be stuff you sometimes find interesting, and 20% might be stuff that you just really love. What's really important is to only focus on the stuff that's critically important. The stuff that is sometimes important is stuff you should be delegating. It's okay to sometimes work on it, but ideally try to get it off your plate, and then absolutely get rid of the stuff that's not urgent or important if you can. It's really critical to maintain your energy. As leaders, what I found myself doing is sometimes I will give this guidance to people I'm leading, but won't take this guidance myself. So understand what gives you energy and what takes it away. It's really important for you to recharge, take real vacations, have real weekends, have a plan for scaling. Schedule calendar blocks that allow you to think and to plan. Delegate everything that you can possibly delegate, except only the things that you can do. Drop balls on purpose, see who picks them up, and track things in a way that generally works. So always be deciding, always be leaving, and always be scaling. That's kind of it for our 3 E's of effectiveness. Invest in a culture that understands and values effectiveness. Enable, empower, and expand. That's it for this talk. I highly recommend some of these books here. I hope this was useful. Thank you.